So in the part 1, we made a distinction between attested and unattested expressions. The point was that in order to verify that, or in order to justify some hypothesis concerning human linguistic behavior, we always have to test the model against both type of expressions, so that we know that what we are actually describing, our hypothesis, matches with the observed reality. I actually can, we had this type of diagram where we kind of schematized the whole idea. But in this part 2, I will be looking at a more concrete example. This example comes from Finnish language. I will just going to illustrate what I presented in this diagram by real linguistic data. So let's first look at the examples. Now, before we go into these examples, I say a few words about them. All of the linguistic examples we are going to be discussing are described by using 3 types of data points or information. First, there will be the original sentence. If the sentence is grammatical or attested, it's an acceptable form, linguistic form for native speakers. The sentence is just written as it is. If it is unattested or ungrammatical, the speakers will not accept it. We use an asterisk or a star at the beginning of the sentence. And then underlining after the original example, there will be a morphological glossing where I will demonstrate how the words in that sentence are composed, what type of linguistic materials they contain. And finally, the third line, there will be a translation, especially if the sentence is grammatical. And the topic I picked here is subject-verb agreement between the subject pronoun and the finite verb. This is just to pick up basically an example at random how all this works. So here are just a couple of Finnish examples first to show what we are talking about. There are 2 sentences, both which are attested, grammatical accepted sentences in Finnish. The first, maalasin aitaa, and the second is a negated sentence, en maalannut aitaa. And what I want to point out here is simply that in the first sentence, which contains the finite verb, we have that the verb itself contains at least three elements. First, there is the verb stem to paint, then past tense morpheme, this here, si, and then the first person singular agreement, en. Notice that the pronoun I or minä is not overtly expressed in this sentence, and that's because Finnish is one of those languages where you can drop the subject pronoun under some circumstances, not always, but here it's possible. And aitaa, which is fence, and partitive case suffix at the end. And the sentence means I painted the fence, or I painted some fence. We can ignore that distinction here because we'll be focusing on agreement. So anyway, the agreement here you can see it occurs in part of the finite verb, and it's expressed by this suffix, first person singular suffix I, corresponding to the subject I. And then there is a second example, en maalannut aitaa. Here we have a negated sentence, and Finnish is a little bit exceptional here that the negation is like behaves like an auxiliary. You can see that now it's a first element in the sentence first, and then the agreement, the first person agreement, is attached or suffixed to the negation. a little bit like an auxiliary verb, but the negation is not really verb because there is no tense and there is no underlining event that it would express. And the verb, when we are talking about past tense, then takes what we call past participle form, nut, and here we have also singular agreement. So if we put this sentence in plural, we could say, we did not paint the fence, emme maalanneet. We would have neet, which is past participle but plural. So we have another agreement information in the verb still, but it's not full agreement because person features are not expressed. So the full agreement is here in the negation. And aita is again partitive of fence, and the sentence means I did not paint the fence, or I did not paint some fence. So this is attested sentences. These are sentences that could be in our data set. These are sentences that if you present them to Finnish speakers, native speakers, they will accept them as normal expressions. You can find these expressions in linguistic production, corpus texts, newspapers, stories. So you see them there. You can record native speakers when they communicate with each other. They're going to sometimes use these expressions or expressions that are very similar to these. And expressions, and they will use agreement always in a way that I'm illustrating here. So it comes to the finite verb, and then it appears on the negation if negation is part of the expression. These are these two examples we can consider as construction types or construction classes. They represent larger classes. So whatever verb you use here, then the pattern is, but whatever regular verb you use here, the pattern is always the same. So the agreement is appears at the end of the verb if it's a finite verb. And if you put negation, then you will have this pattern where the negation is part of the, where the agreement is part of the negation, the full agreement, and the verb only carries this partial agreement in number only. Okay, so this is in a typical study, the dataset will contain many more examples and much more data, but here we are just going to illustrate something, so we can go with these two. But as I mentioned, and if you go back again to this diagram, these expressions would now be here in this intersection where we have attested expressions. But if we want to develop a hypothesis of Finnish agreement, or to understand the rules that are underlying these patterns we are seeing here, and at the later time on this presentation I will be talking about what these rules could be, but now we put them aside. If we want to develop a theory or hypothesis concerning this agreement pattern, we have to also test it against unattested examples, sentences which never occur as part of normal communication or normal language use when it comes to Finnish. Now, question here is, how can we do that? Where do we find these unattested expressions if they are never attested? And here, the one principle we can apply is that we look at the different components or factors or syntactic variables which are manifested in these examples, especially insofar as they are relevant for agreement. And then we simply create permutations of those variables, and we come up with other possible patterns we can imagine, but which we don't attest in real Finnish or Finnish communication. So for example, here we have, let's think about what we had here. We had the verb, that was one element. Then there was a negation, another element, and then there was full agreement in person and number, which was changing its place depending on whether the negation was there or not. That was one element, and then we had this participle form of the verb when we wanted to express the tense, past tense. So now we can create from those elements, by combining them in different ways, we can create several additional expressions that we can then find that we never observe in real linguistic behavior when it comes to Finnish speakers. And we can test also Finnish speakers in laboratory by showing them these sentences and asking them to report if they find them correct or incorrect, or grammatical or not grammatical. So here are just a couple of examples what we can create when I use this type of combinatorics. Sentence number 3, ei maalasin aitaa. And again, you can check from the line below what type of linguistic information there is. What I did here is I took the negation and the verb and I added, and I used the third person singular kind of default agreement on the negation, and then I used the regular finite verb together with the agreement after it. So A is a default agreement form for negation, and then maalasin was the verb form that we would normally use when there is no negation. So this is the verb from sentence 1. And no Finnish speaker will accept this and never use this sentence except by mistake. If they read this kind of text, they will immediately correct it. They react strongly by saying that this is not right. Ei maalasin aitaa, not possible. But there is nothing logically wrong with this sentence, because in Italian language, for example, Italian language works much like this, that the sentence just begins with the negation that has one default form, and then the verb is in the regular finite form as it is here. But Finnish, we can't say like that. For sentence number 4, en maalasin aitaa, here I added full agreement form into both the negation and the verb. And again, the same is true, that nobody would accept this pattern. You don't find this type of examples regularly from anywhere, and if you find, they are mistakes. And number 5 was a combination of agreement on negation, and then there is a participle form, and then there was a regular agreement suffix added to the participle form. So en maalannutin aitaa. It's not possible. And so on and so forth. You can create all sorts of combinations from these elements and to check if they are part of Finnish human linguistic behavior when it comes to Finnish. And these are type of sentences that we have to have in our dataset, because we have to make sure that whatever it is that we propose, that the theory doesn't predict this type of sentences that are never attested or observed. And in my view is that this is something that for many, especially when you are beginning to work with linguistic materials, when you do your first studies or you try to understand linguistic theories, that this is a quite non-trivial thing to, how can I say, it's not easy to begin to work with that kind of expressions, simply because they are not part of Finnish. In our regular normal life, we never encounter patterns like that, what I just showed. And we never think about them before we start doing real research. we never consider that that's interesting or important, because this kind of sentences, we never see them anywhere. It's also strange that we have to pay so much attention to linguistic patterns that are unattested. They seem irrelevant. They seem bizarre. They seem something that you would really want. Your first reaction would be that I just want to ignore this nonsense. But it's extremely crucial that that whatever theories or hypotheses you develop, that you will check that theory against this type of data. And so that's the reason why we will have we have to pay attention to this type of expressions. And if we don't pay any attention to them, then there's no way that we can justify any hypothesis that is about the human linguistic behavior. This type of sentences, you could try to feed them for a machine translator or in a conversation with artificial intelligence, and they don't really, at least those that I have tried, they never react to this type of things, because they are not really, these programs are not really trying to understand how human languages work. Okay, so that was just to illustrate what this means in a more concrete sense. Now let's just conclude by looking at this data a bit more seriously. I'm just doing this to illustrate this methods a bit further. We go a bit further here. So I suppose that you have this type of data available. We will have this in some type of data set, which will contain many more attested examples and many more unattested ones. In a later presentation, I'm gonna discuss how these actual data sets can be constructed. But now we just imagine that we have it. And then we start to, then we have to find a hypothesis or theory to explain that data. So what we would do here, the first step would be to think about if there is any general pattern that the Finnish speakers are following when they create the specific forms that are attested, and why they don't use this type of sentences which are not attested that I just illustrated. Or is this just completely random? That's a possibility also, that the Finnish speakers just have decided to use willy-nilly agreement here or there, and there's no principle, no general overarching regularity. But in this case, it's quite easy to notice that that the actual rule that the Finnish speakers seem to be following is that full agreement in both person and number, always appears on the highest or first verb-like element. And the verb-like element here just includes also the negation. So here is just some additional data illustrating this, this regularity. You can see that if you look, I'm not gonna go this data now here in a very detailed way, it's not relevant, but if you stop this video and look at this data, what's happening here, you can see very clearly that the full agreement that I have been emphasizing in each of these examples, first person singular, it is in a bolded character, you always find it at the end of the first or the highest verb-like element, whether it's a main verb, finite verb, auxiliary verb, or negation. And a particular clear way to see this is to look at these auxiliaries. So here, when the auxiliary verb is the first element, you can find the full agreement occurs as a last element. But when there is a negation and the auxiliary verb is the second, then it's literally the case that the agreement suffix disappears. So you compare this olen with the form ole. And you can see that what happens is that this first person singular suffix, which is here, it jumps into the negation and it disappears from the auxiliary. So it always the Finnish speakers seem to be putting it into the first or highest element. So that's the rule that you can come up as a kind of a first approach. And what we would do next, based on this data, we would now formulate a completely unambiguous hypothesis. Hypothesis which tells what do we mean by first element or highest element, or which one it is actually. What do we mean by verb like? And then we would make these assumptions completely unambiguous or rigorous, and then run that hypothesis against the data set of, as I just described. And you can see again that once you do this, once we have this idea in a more precise form, it's absolutely crucial that it's also checked against these possible but not attested forms. For example, we have to make sure that for example here, that we have a sentence where we have full agreement both on the negation and on the verb, so that when we make this hypothesis completely exact or clear, we say that the agreement occurs on the highest or first element, that the hypothesis is formulated in such a way that it can never occur on two elements, or in other words, that it only occurs only on the highest and first element and never anywhere else. So in that way, it's completely clear in my view why we have to make these tests and have these elements in our data set. Okay, but that was all I wanted to illustrate in this second part. To summarize, if you want to do linguistic research and make this assumption that the interest is human linguistic behavior, in this case it's the linguistic behavior of Finnish speakers, then it's simply inevitable or necessary that most of your data, or a large portion of your data, will have to contain unattested examples like the 3, 4, and 5 in this series. Even though you might think that this is completely irrelevant because nobody is using this type of sentences ever. But we are not constructing these examples to claim that there is an imaginary Finnish that would use these expressions, but rather it's simply there to make sure that our hypothesis really captures the properties of some human language or human behavior. And so that's how we will and how we have to create data sets for our investigation.